Welcome to the Constitution Review. The Constitution is the rules for running our government. The Constitution is considered the supreme law of the land. It starts with an introduction called the Preamble. The Preamble lists the 6 goals for our government and begins with the words, "We the people." This represents the fact that our government gets its power from the people and the consent of the governed. And that's very strong because there were very few governments when we wrote the Constitution that got their power from the people. Most were monarchies that had inherited power, even if they had created some kind of democratic government to go along with that. The government was divided into 3 branches using the principle of separation of powers. The legislative branch was given the job of making laws, the executive branch the job of enforcing those laws, and the judicial branch had the job of interpreting the laws and determining whether or not they were constitutional. The legislative branch is discussed in Article 1 of the Constitution. It is also referred to as Congress, and according to the Great Compromise, our Congress is made up of 2 houses, the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Representatives. This is a picture of the Congressional Building in Washington, D.C. The House of Representatives is based on population. That was part of our Great Compromise. The greater the population in the state, the more representatives it gets. Representatives must be at least 25 years old in order to run for office. They must have been a citizen for at least 7 years, live in the district and state that they are representing, and they are elected for a 2-year term. We currently have 435 members in the House of Representatives. This is our current representative, and he was just reelected on November the 2nd. The Senate, the other part of Congress, the upper house, is based on equality based on the Great Compromise. There are 2 senators for each state, no matter how large or small the population. Everyone gets 2 senators or 2 votes. Since we have 50 states, there are currently 100 senators in the Senate. A senator must be at least 30 years old to run for office, have been a citizen at least 9 years, and live in the state they're representing. Senators are elected to a 6-year term, but in the very first election for senators, they had 3 categories. A third were elected for 2 years, a third for 4 years, and a third for 6 years. This way, every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is replaced, or I shouldn't say replaced. They are go through a campaign and are either reelected or replaced. Our senators currently from California are Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, who just retained her Senate seat in the November 2nd election. The executive branch is discussed in Article 2 of the Constitution. The executive branch is headed by the President. The President is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, as well as being the diplomatic leader. He meets all the ambassadors and leaders from other countries. He negotiates treaties, recommends legislation, all sorts of other things. The President is elected to a 4-year term of office. He can only serve 2 terms. We passed an amendment requiring that the President serve no more than 2 terms or a total of 8 years. The President must be a citizen by birth. They cannot be a naturalized citizen. They must be born an American citizen. And they have to be at least 35 years old and have lived in the United States at least 14 years. Our current president is President Barack Obama. He is the first minority president that we have ever elected in America. That means he's the first non-Caucasian male that we've ever elected. The vice president is Vice President Joe Biden. His job primarily is to do whatever the president needs him to do, and to be there if the president falls ill, is killed, or impeached or removed from office. His job is to take over as the next president. This is one side of the White House, and here it is from the other side. Again, it's in Washington, D.C. The judicial branch is discussed in Article 3. That is our federal court system. Basically, we call it the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices, 1 Chief Justice, and 8 Associate Justices. They are appointed by the President, and those appointments have to be confirmed by the Senate. Supreme Court justices are appointed for life or until retirement. That's so they can make decisions without having to be beholden to someone to get reelected. They can be removed for wrongdoing, and this is the Judicial Building in Washington, D.C. And I don't know who that guy is. This is just a picture of the building. Some of the principles in the Constitution. I told you already about separation of powers. We also have the principle of popular sovereignty, the power coming from the people. We use the principle of checks and balances. The framers of the Constitution, or the people who wrote it, set up this system of checks and balances in order to keep any one branch from becoming more powerful than the others. And so each branch has the power to check or limit the power of the other branches. An example of that is that Congress passes laws, but it requires the president's signature for them to go into effect. If the president chooses not to sign it, that's called a veto, and then the bill doesn't pass. It goes back to Congress. Congress then can check the veto power of the president by doing what's called overriding his veto with a 2/3 vote of both houses, and then it becomes a law anyway. Then the Supreme Court steps in and determines whether that law is constitutional or not. Now, they don't just step in automatically. Someone has to bring a suit to the Supreme Court for them to look at a law to determine whether it's constitutional or not. Another principle that we use in our Constitution is called federalism. The power of the government is split between the states and the federal government. That's what federalism is. It's that sharing of that power between the federal and the state government. If the Constitution does not have a law about a particular situation, then the states can make their own laws. The state law, however, cannot contradict or go against a federal law. And the federal law always has supremacy. If there is a conflict, the federal law is the one that has to be followed. Dual sovereignty is another principle that we discuss or use in our Constitution, and that's very similar to federalism. Again, meaning that anything that is not regulated by the federal government is left up to the states to regulate. And so that's things like what age you can get married, do we have the death penalty. The framers, the writers of the Constitution, also understood that conditions in the country would change over time. They were smart enough to see the world wasn't going to stay the same. And so they provided a way to change or amend the Constitution. And George Washington was quoted as saying, "I do not think we are more inspired, have more wisdom, or possess more virtue than those who will come after us." The Constitution can be amended, changed, but it's not easy. It takes a 3/4 vote of both houses or state conventions. Currently, to date, there have only been 27 amendments made to the Constitution since it was written, and 10 of those were immediately added, and that was the Bill of Rights. That was part of the compromise to get the Anti-Federalists to agree to the Constitution. And there you have the basics of the Constitution and some of the principles.